We generally focus in on our destiny and what we're preparing for, and we focus in on a lot of the scriptures that relate to the world tomorrow. Ezekiel chapter 37 is a chapter that has some very important information in it. Now, generally, we think of Ezekiel 37 in terms of the valley of dry bones and the general resurrection, what we often call the white throne judgment. Well, actually, Ezekiel 37 records two different visions that Ezekiel had. And the first part of Ezekiel 37 on down through verse 14 records one vision, and that's the one we usually focus on. But notice in verse 15, the word of the Lord came again unto me, saying. So now Ezekiel has a second vision, one that is distinct from what he had just seen. And it's this vision that I would like to focus on because it sets the stage for something that I think it's very important for us to look at and to understand. God's word came again to Ezekiel, and in this vision, verse 16 of Ezekiel 37, Moreover, you son of man, take you one stick, and write upon it for Judah, and for the children of Israel his companions. Then take another stick, and write upon it for Joseph, the stick of Ephraim, and for all the house of Israel his companions. And join them one to another into one stick, and they shall become one in your hand. Now, at the time Ezekiel was writing this, the house of Israel, Ephraim, and all of the tribes, the house of Israel, the northern kingdom, had been in captivity for about 130 years. Judah was in the process of going into captivity. The first couple of captivities of Judah had already taken place. The final destruction of Jerusalem had not yet occurred, but was just on the verge of happening. Ezekiel was himself a Jewish captive in the area of Babylon. So Ezekiel certainly understood and knew, and all of his contemporaries understood and knew, that the house of Israel and the house of Judah were two totally distinct, different groups. They had had a separate history at the time Ezekiel was writing for well over 300 years. It had been well over 300 years earlier that Solomon had died, and the kingdom had split. 300 years ago, that was 1698. That's a lot of time that has gone by, and a lot of things happened. That was the equivalent amount of time that the Israel and Judah had split into two nations. They had continued on parallel for about 200 of those years, and then about 200 years after Solomon's death, Israel, the northern tribes, Ephraim and the northern 10 tribes, were taken into Assyrian captivity, settled, we're told, in the cities of the Medes, up in the area sort of between the Black and the Caspian Sea up north of the river Gozan. And they were settled there. Well over 100 years later, about 130 years later, the Babylonians began to come in and take Judah captive. So, when Ezekiel took these two sticks and he wrote on them for Joseph, Ephraim and the house of Israel his companions, for Judah and the children of Israel his companions, these represented two totally distinct nations. Nations that had been distinct, though they had a common background and a common history. In the past, they had been distinct for over 300 years by the time Ezekiel was writing. So people understood when he had two different sticks, but then he joined them together and he made one stick. And God told him in verse 18, when the children of your people shall speak unto you, saying, won't you show us what you mean by this? That was going to puzzle them. Seeing the two sticks wouldn't puzzle them, but seeing them joined together. Now, you tell them, when they ask you, what do you mean by joining them together? This is what you tell them. God says, behold, I will take the stick of Joseph, which is in the hand of Ephraim, and the tribes of Israel his fellows, and I will put them with him, even with the stick of Judah, and make them one stick, and they'll be one in my hand. Now, when's that going to happen? Well, the stick whereon you write shall be in your hand before their eyes. And say unto them, thus says the Lord Eternal, behold, I will take the children of Israel from among the heathen, among the nations, whither they be gone. I'll gather them on every side, bring them into their own land, and I will make them one nation, in the land upon the mountains of Israel, and one king shall be king to them all. And they shall be no more two nations, neither shall they be divided into two kingdoms any more at all. Neither shall they defile themselves any more with their idols, nor with their detestable things, nor with any of their transgressions. But I will save them out of all their dwelling places wherein they have sinned, and will cleanse them. So shall they be my people, and I will be their God. And David my servant shall be king over them. And they shall all have one shepherd. And they shall also walk in my judgments, observe my statutes, and do them. And they will dwell in the land that I've given unto Jacob my servant, wherein your fathers have dwelt. They'll dwell therein, even they and their children's children forever. And my servant David shall be their prince forever. Now, you know, for those who have the idea, and this is, of course, the common idea in the world, and a lot of folks who ought to know better, people who used to sit side by side with us, the common explanation, Protestant explanation, is that Israel and Judah, that's all the same thing. Why? You know, they're all Jews. This section alone ought to clearly demonstrate that the house of Israel and the house of Judah are clearly distinct and will not be rejoined and become one people until the time that God intervenes, delivers them from captivity, sets them in their own land, and King David is their king. Now, King David's dead and in his grave. He's been there for a long, long time. You know, even in Peter's day, in Acts chapter 2, Peter said, David is dead and buried, and his sepulchre is with us to this day. King David isn't anywhere around, and yet when this occurs, when Israel and Judah are rejoined as one nation, King David will be their king. My servant David shall be their prince forever. This is talking about the resurrected King David. That he's going to be king over all of Israel, all of the tribes. Clearly, Israel and Judah have remained distinct and will not be rejoined until the future. But God will make them one nation, and there will be one king. It will be a time when they will all become converted. They will not defile themselves anymore with idols. God will save them, and King David will be their king. Now, there are other places that refer to this event as well, but I would like to sort of stop at this point to pose a question. How did God go about preparing David for such a destiny? Have you ever thought about that? David was not only king over Israel in the past. His destiny is that he's going to come up out of his grave, and he is going to be the king over all of Israel. He's going to be their prince forever. You know, God prepared David to be a king. God prepared David to be king over all of Israel. When Jesus Christ returns, he's going to be King of kings, Lord of lords. We're told that our destiny is also to be kings and priests. You know, in Revelation chapter 5 and verse 10, verse 9, John records that Christ redeemed a people to God by his blood out of every kindred and people and tongue and nation. He redeemed us from whatever our background. We've all been redeemed by the blood of Jesus Christ. And what's our destiny? Verse 10 of Revelation 5, we've been made unto our God kings and priests. We shall reign on the earth. Not float off to heaven somewhere, but reign on the earth as kings and priests. That's our destiny. Those who are redeemed from whatever background. John records in Revelation 20 and verse 4 that he saw thrones. He saw a vision, and in that vision he saw thrones, and he saw those that sat upon those thrones. And judgment was given unto them. They were going to be exercising rulership and responsibility. And among those that sat on those thrones, he saw the souls of those that had been beheaded for the witness of Jesus and for the Word of God. He saw those that had not worshipped the beast, not worshipped the image of the beast. He saw those that had not received the mark of the beast upon their foreheads or in their hands. He saw those who had been loyal to God and who had rejected the false ways, and he saw them live and reign with Christ 1,000 years. You're going to reign, to be kings and priests. We have a destiny as kings and priests. We're going to reign upon the earth. King David will have a higher job certainly than any of us. He's going to reign over all of the tribes of Israel. Christ told the 12 apostles that they would sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes, each apostle being responsible for one tribe. But over them will be King David. Now that is a tremendous responsibility, and yet all of us are training on some level, regardless of how many cities or how much territory we will be responsible for. We are being trained and prepared. Our destiny is to be rulers, to be kings and priests. I think that it's important to look at the qualities. God spends a lot of time recording various things about David, both in terms of record of actions and events in David's life, and also the words of David are recorded at great length. Much of the Psalms was written by David. And as we go through some of these things, we can understand a little bit of how God trained and prepared David. And as we understand how David was prepared to be a king, how he had developed in him the heart of a king, there are many lessons and parallels that we can apply in our own lives and in the circumstances with which we're faced. I think it's interesting to note that David's basic background was that of a shepherd. That's where, when we first are introduced to David back in the book of 1 Samuel, that's where we find him. He's out in the field watching over the sheep. Now, the two greatest leaders in the Old Testament, the two greatest leaders of Israel would be Moses and King David. Moses was used of God to actually create the nation, as it were, at least on a human level. He was the one that took a group of slaves and led them out of Egypt, and in that sense was God's human instrument to craft a nation, to give law, to establish government, to set up the structure, to govern them for 40 years, to bring them from Egypt up to the Promised Land. Moses was used in a remarkable way by God to create a nation. David was used in a remarkable way. He also reigned over Israel as king for 40 years. Interestingly, he and Moses both administered the government for the same length of time. David, in one sense, also was a creator of the nation, because he took a loose amalgam of tribes that were divided between themselves and crafted a mighty, powerful, great nation that was able to receive the blessings and the benefits of God's promises. And in each case, God was preparing Moses and David for a destiny that went far beyond just that period over which they administered his government in the physical nation. Now, how did God train Moses? You might think a little bit. Say, well, Moses had a lot of experience in leadership. He grew up in Egypt as a prince of Egypt. Pharaoh's daughter adopted him. Stephen tells us in his sermon recorded in Acts chapter 7 that Moses was a man mighty in words and deeds among the Egyptians. Now, God trained Moses in Egypt for 40 years, and you'd think, well, at the end of that time, Moses is 40 years old. Obviously, he is right at the point, he's at his peak, right? I mean, in terms of physical strength and health and vitality and maturity and experience, all these things. He ought to be ready to lead Israel out of Egypt. He ought to be ready to do the work. Now, he's 40 years old. He's been trained with the best that Egypt had to offer. No. God said, Moses, you've got some unlearning to do. You've been trained in Egypt for 40 years. How did God propose to retrain Moses? Well, Moses had to flee Egypt, went out in the wilderness, and for the next 40 years of Moses' life, he was a shepherd. He watched the sheep for Jethro, his father-in-law. He was a shepherd for 40 years, and at the end of that time, he was 80. And God said, now you're ready. Now you're ready to come back to Egypt and to bring my people out. I have trained you as a shepherd. It's interesting when you get to the New Testament, you see shepherd is the metaphor God uses as a descriptive of the leaders of his people. Christ, we're told in John 10, Christ said, I'm the good shepherd. Peter talks about there that when Christ, who is the chief shepherd, shall appear. Christ is the chief shepherd. Here, notice what we're told in Ezekiel 37, verse 24, David my servant shall be king over them, and they all shall have one shepherd. You see, the skills David learned in dealing with the sheep were skills that God wanted him to carry over into dealing with people. Now, I think it's interesting. You know, God designed animals and designed the natures of them. Most of us didn't grow up around. I doubt most of us had much experience with sheep. I didn't growing up. We had cattle. Now, you know, there's a lot of difference between sheep and cattle. You drive cattle. You know, that's there's a lot of difference between being a cattle driver and a shepherd. You want to get cattle from one place to the next. You can drive them. You can herd them. You don't drive sheep. You sure as the world don't drive goats. You can lead them. You can lead them, but you can't drive them. Now, it's interesting because in Moses and in David's case, God trained them as a shepherd and developed in them certain patterns of, He taught them, see, in dealing with animals, He taught them principles that He wanted them to carry over in the way they dealt with people. And they learned certain aspects and certain principles that God said, all right, that is a model because now you have learned to shepherd sheep. I want you to be the shepherd of my people. You're going to be their king. In other words, you're going to be their shepherd. That's what it means, you see, to be a king. You're going to be the shepherd of my people. So David had that understanding, had that model in his mind that being a shepherd was David's model for being a ruler. And so God prepared him in that way in terms of background. But it wasn't, okay, well now you're ready, you've had a few years as a shepherd, you're a young man, I'm ready to turn you loose to rule Israel, and you're obviously ready to rule Israel forever. Oh no. No, there were a lot of things that David went through, and a lot of what David went through was not very pleasant to go through. God began to deal with David as a young man. We're introduced to him as a teenager. And God, when we read the account back in 1 Samuel, where David was anointed as king, and he was a teenager, maybe somewhere around 16. He was anointed as king. But you know, he couldn't tell anybody. You remember the account when God told Samuel, He said, I want you to go down to Bethlehem to the house of Jesse, and I want you to anoint one of his sons as king. Samuel's first response, he said, are you sure? If Saul hears about it, he'll kill me. Now, if Saul would have killed Samuel over something like that, how much more quickly would he have killed David? So, David was anointed king, but he couldn't tell anybody. Couldn't go around bragging about it. Couldn't, say anything. He was anointed as king, but he didn't become king He went through his ups and downs, his highs and lows over the next few years, the next 2 or 3 years. He was brought into contact there with the court of King Saul, became a national hero in Israel, and boy, it seemed like things were moving along well. And then he spent virtually the entire decade of his 20s, because David became king at age 30. He spent virtually the entire decade of his 20s on the run, hiding out, in fear of his life, going from one problem to another. Every time it seemed like something was getting a little better, then something happened and it got worse. And he went through a very difficult, trying time, waiting for the fulfillment of what God had promised him. Now, in Psalm 18, let's notice Psalm 18. Notice the setting of Psalm 18. The title, right here under the word Psalm 18, it says, "To the chief musician, a psalm of David, the servant of the Lord, who spoke unto the Lord the words of this song in the day that the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul." Here is David at the end of this period of running and hiding. Here is David after all of this period of adversity and difficulty. Here's David after Saul had been chasing him and trying to get him. Here is David finally having been delivered. What has David learned during these 10 years on the run? What has David learned during the time that he has been going through all this difficulty? Notice here, Psalm 18, verse 1. "I will love you, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock, my fortress, my deliverer, my God, my strength, in whom I will trust, my buckler, the horn of my salvation, my high tower." Everything that David could think of that symbolized strength and protection and security, God was the one who had seen him through everything. Verse 3, "I'll call upon the Lord who is worthy to be praised, so shall I be saved from my enemies. The sorrows of death compassed me, the floods of the ungodly made me afraid, the sorrows of the grave compassed me about, the snares of death prevented me. In my distress I called upon the Lord and cried unto my God. And he heard my voice out of his temple, and my cry came before him, even into his ears." David said, "I've been surrounded by death and the threat of death. I've been surrounded by the sorrows of the grave. I've been threatened on every side. And yet through this period of time, what had David learned? I will love you, O Lord, my strength." David had learned to trust God and to walk with God. Had learned to trust and walk with God in a remarkable way. God was preparing David for a destiny. A destiny that not only involved rulership at that time for a 40-year period and establishing the nation of Israel, but God was preparing David for a destiny that would endure forever. Now, in order to prepare him for that destiny, he didn't give him an easy, cushy life, did he? David didn't have just everything just sort of fell in place and everything always went right and things came easily to David. Oh no, you read the story and you read of all the difficulty and all of the problems and all of the things. But in his distress, he called on God. He said that the floods of ungodly men made me afraid. David had to deal with fears. He was encompassed behind and before. But what did he do when he was surrounded by things that made him afraid? Well, in his distress, he called on God. And he learned some things. Notice in verse 17, speaking of God, "He delivered me from my strong enemy, and from them which hated me. They were too strong for me." God allowed David to fall into circumstance after circumstance where he could not deliver himself. where he could not deliver himself. And God delivered him. Now, as he comes on down, verse 20, the Lord rewarded me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of my hands as he recompensed me. For I've kept the ways of the eternal, and have not wickedly departed from my God. For all his judgments were before me, and I did not put away his statutes from me. I was also upright before him, and I kept myself from my iniquity. Therefore, as the Lord recompensed me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of my hands in his eyesight, with the merciful you shall show yourself merciful, and with an upright man you shall show yourself upright. You see, David was encompassed with things to make him fearful. David was surrounded by difficulty and adversity. Now it's interesting because the way David dealt with those things was distinctly different from the way King Saul dealt with it. Saul also was faced with fears and insecurities. We're going to see that a little bit later, because just as David qualified to be a king, Saul disqualified himself as king. Saul's response to the circumstances in life that he faced disqualified him for the destiny of kingship. But David learned to trust God. He learned how to exercise mercy. Verse 25, with the merciful you'll show yourself merciful. You know, David had circumstances where Saul came right within his hand. It was within his grasp to solve his problems as he would look upon them from a human standpoint. God delivered his enemy into his hand. And Saul was his enemy. Saul was trying to kill him. Saul tried to kill him on several occasions. How many times do you need somebody to try to kill you? To begin to figure out maybe they don't like you. You know, once is bad enough. Of course, maybe you think, well, maybe it misfired. He wasn't really shooting at me. It just it misfired. But you know if that happened 2 or 3 times? How many times would it have to happen when you ducked and the bullet went right where you were, that you began to think, I don't think that guy likes me. I think he's doing that on purpose. Now, Saul didn't have a gun. He had a javelin. Now, maybe first time, maybe he made the excuse that the javelin misfired. He was just sort of sitting there playing with it, and it just sort of went off. But, there were several different occasions. We'll notice a few of them. There were several different occasions where that javelin went right where David was. David ducked. David got out of the way. The javelin stuck in the wall. There was no question Saul wanted to kill him. I mean, Saul meant business. And yet, David found himself in circumstances during the years he was on the run. His whole life was disrupted. His family was disrupted. Everything was turned topsy-turvy. And for the decade of his 20s, or most of that decade, he spent on the run. He spent trying to hide, trying to get away, trying to avoid being killed. And on a couple of occasions, God worked circumstances out where Saul came right within his grasp. And in a matter of seconds, he could have dispatched him. He was right there. He had a sword. He could have just skewered him through. And the problem would have been over with. That would have solved it, right? That's what David's friends around him thought get him. God's delivered him into your hands. What are you waiting for? David said, who can lift up his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? Now, there's no question that Saul has been and is being a very bad king. But God set him in that high office. And David held that office in such high regard that he said, I can't lift up my hand against him. I can't dispatch him. I can't do something. David was learning. He was preparing to be a king. With the merciful, you will show yourself merciful. David learned some things about mercy. Verse 43, you've delivered me from the strivings of the people. Verse 48, he delivered me from my enemies. Verse 50, great deliverance gives he to his king, and shows mercy to his anointed, to David, and to his seed forevermore. You see, David learned some things. This is, as David looked back on and reflected on these years at the end of this period of time when he was finally delivered and became king. He looked back on that period of his life, and he was thankful for what he had learned. And he had learned to walk with God. He had learned to trust God and to rely on God. He had learned to walk with God in a remarkable way. You see, God was preparing David for something. A starting point of being a righteous ruler. We're told in Exodus 18, remember, when Moses was first going to organize the government for ancient Israel. What was he to look for in the men that he set over the nation? Able men, we're told. They had to be men of capacity. Able men such as fear God and hate covetousness. Oh. It's not enough just to have able men. You know, we've got a lot of capable people in this country. Men who have great ability, who have outstanding personality, men who are very intelligent, men who have great education, men who have many different traits that are good, but they don't fear God. Well, if you've got an able man who doesn't fear God, you've just got a smart crook. And we've had a lot of those. You know, and a smart crook can fleece you a lot quicker than a dumb crook. If you're going to deal with a crook, at least deal with a dumb one. If you've got a smart crook, you're in trouble. So it's not enough just to have able men such as fear God. Individuals who first and foremost walk in the reverence and awe of God. God is real to them. And they really worship and stand in awe of God. You see, David was a man who feared God. God was real to David. And David went through circumstance after circumstance, and he saw God's hand in his life. And David learned to wait on God and to rely on God and to walk with God and to trust God. David was preparing to be king not only for that time, but he's going to wake up, come out of his grave in power and glory, and he's going to be a king forever. And God was preparing him in that way. Now, let's go back to 1 Samuel. We'll pick up the story in 1 Samuel chapter 16. First Samuel chapter 16, verse 1, the Eternal said unto Samuel, How long will you mourn for Saul, seeing I've rejected him from reigning over all Israel? Fill your horn with oil, and I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided me a king among his sons. So Samuel went down there, did what God told him, and Jesse and his sons were sanctified and called to the sacrifice, verse 5. In verse 6, it came to pass when they were come that he looked on Eliab. And when Samuel saw Eliab, his thought was, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. He just looked at Eliab and he could tell this was Jesse's oldest son, and there was just something about his demeanor, the way he carried himself, the way he looked, his personality, all these things. Samuel saw him and he just knew this is the king. Surely the Lord's anointed is before him. The Lord said unto Samuel, Don't look on his countenance or on the height of his stature, because I have refused him. For the Eternal sees not as man sees. For man looks on the outward appearance, but the Eternal looks on the heart. Oh. God was more after and was more concerned about the heart of a king than about the appearance of a king. And here we come to a crucial thing. You see, if God was going to prepare David to be king forever, He had to develop within David the heart of a king. If you and I are going to be kings forever, we have to have developed within us the heart of a king. Because God looks on the heart. Now, we talked about last Sabbath the fact of God creating a new heart, giving us a new heart. What is the heart of a king? How did God begin to deal with David and to produce this within him? Well, as we go on here in verse 8, Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel, and he said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this." And Jesse made Shammah to pass by, and he said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this." Again, Jesse made 7 of his sons to pass before Samuel. And finally, Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord has not chosen these." And Samuel said to Jesse, "Is this all the kids you have? These all your children?" And Jesse said, "Well, there remains yet the youngest. We didn't bother to bring him in. He's out there with the sheep." And Samuel said unto Jesse, "Well, you better send and fetch him, because we're not going to sit down and eat until he gets here." And he sent and brought him in. He was ruddy and of a beautiful countenance and goodly to look upon. And the Lord said, "Arise and anoint him, for this is he." Then Samuel took the horn of oil, anointed him in the midst of his brethren. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him, came upon David from that day forward. Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. God began to deal with David in a remarkable way. The Spirit of the Lord came on David. David was anointed, set apart as a king. Now, he didn't become king at this moment, but God had chosen him. And God saw something in David that he did not see in any of his brothers. There was something about David, about his inner person, about his heart, that God saw. And that, you see, is what God was looking for. Now, as we go on down through the story, in chapter 17, we come to the account of David and Goliath. Notice a little bit as we'll pick it up in verse 26 of 1 Samuel 17. David spoke to the men that stood by him. And he said, "What shall be done to the man that kills this Philistine?" Talking of Goliath. "And takes away the reproach from Israel. For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" And the people answered him after this matter and said, "Well, this is what's going to be done." Notice verse 28. Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men. And Eliab's anger was kindled against David. Eliab was mad. And he said, "Why did you come down here? With whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the naughtiness of your heart. You're come down here that you might see the battle." "Yeah, kid, I know why you're here. You know, all this excitement. You came down here to see the battle. Well, what did you do with the sheep? Why aren't you back there tending to them?" Now, David said, verse 29, "What have I now done? Is there not a cause?" And he turned from him toward another and spoke after the same manner, and the people answered him again. When the words were heard by which David spoke, somebody went and told Saul, and he sent for him. In verse 32, David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him," because of Goliath. "Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You're not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him. You're but a youth." David wasn't even 20 yet. He was a teenager. Undoubtedly an older teenager, but nevertheless, maybe 18 or 19. He was not 20. He was not old enough to be a part of the army. Saul said, you can't go fight him. You're a youth, and he's been a man of war since his youth." And David said to Saul, "Your servant has kept his father's sheep." He said, "Well, I understand what's involved. I've been a shepherd. I've got the training. I've been a shepherd." You see, when you're a shepherd, you're responsible for taking care of the sheep and guarding them. And in the area where we have our sheep, they're wild animals. In fact, one day there was a lion that came and caught one of my father's sheep. You think I'm going to stand by and let a lion take one of these sheep away? One day there was a bear that came and caught one of these sheep. You think I'm going to stand by and see a bear steal one of my sheep? Verse 35, I went out after him and I smote him and delivered it out of his mouth. And David didn't have a 30-06 that he was standing back at a long distance from to do his smiting either. He said, I went after him and smote him, delivered it out of his mouth. When he arose up against me, I caught him by his beard and smote him and slew him. Your servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, saying he's defied the armies of the living God. David was courageous. You know, it's interesting, Eliab looked like a king. Samuel was impressed with him from the moment he saw him. But Eliab didn't have the heart of a king. He'd been down there for 40 days. He'd had 40 days to go out and fight Goliath. If he was such a brave, valiant man, how come he hadn't volunteered? Almost 6 weeks had gone by. Goliath had come out and taunted the Israelites every day. But you see, when David came down there, he was outraged. And here was this uncircumcised Philistine challenging the armies of the living God. David had learned a sense of responsibility as a shepherd. He was responsible for every single sheep. And he had that sense of responsibility. And he had the courage to go out and fight whatever it was that might come against it. And he said, God delivered me. Verse 37, the Lord has delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear. He will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said unto David, will go, and the Lord be with you. So David went out. You remember the story. He took his slingshot, his rocks out of the brook there, and he went out to slay Goliath, and he did. And this, of course, was a remarkable thing, and the whole story of what had been going on just completely reversed. Here Israel was victorious, and the Philistine army broke and ran. And people celebrated. And we find here, as we come on down to chapter 18, in verse 6, it came to pass as they came, and when David was returning from the slaughter of the Philistines, that the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tabrets, with joy, with instruments of music. And the women answered one another as they played, and one of the verses of the song was, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. David was the hero of the moment. Now Saul, we're told in verse 8, was very wroth, and the saying displeased him. Saul was a very insecure person, and when he heard in this just popular song, in this celebration, when he heard somebody singing a song that ascribed more people to David than to him, he was furious. And we're told in verse 9, Saul eyed David from that day forward. Saul began to look on David as an enemy. He looked on David as a threat. He was scared of David. He was jealous of David. And he brooded about it. And Saul became increasingly obsessed. And that's really the only word you can use. He was obsessed with David. His fears became the controlling, dominating thing in his life. We read in verse 10 that the next day, this evil spirit that God had allowed was coming and troubling Saul. And David was sitting there playing music, soothing music, to try to, create a positive atmosphere and enable Saul to relax. And Saul was ranting and raving and pacing around there. And there was a javelin in his hand. In verse 11, Saul cast the javelin, where he said, I'll smite David even to the wall. And David avoided out of his presence twice. Now, first time, maybe, just maybe, that was an accident. By the time the second time had come, I'm sure David knew that this was no accident. Verse 12, Saul was afraid of David, because the Lord was with him and was departed from Saul. We're told in verse 14, David behaved himself wisely in all his ways. The Lord was with him. When Saul saw that he behaved himself very wisely, he was afraid of him. All Israel and Judah loved David. Fear was the dominant controlling factor in Saul's life. He was afraid of him. When he saw him doing a good job, when he saw him handling responsibility well, Saul became increasingly afraid. On down in verse 28, Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. And Saul was yet the more afraid of David. And Saul became David's enemy continually. Increasingly afraid of David. And David, what David is doing and what is going to happen, this was just the continual thing in Saul's mind. Well, as we come on into chapter 19, we find that in verse 8, there was war again, and David went out and fought with the Philistines and slew them with a great slaughter, and they fled from him. And this evil spirit that God had allowed was upon Saul once again, as he sat in the house with his javelin in his hand. And David played. Now, you know, Saul must have kept this javelin in his hand a lot of the time. He was sort of like this, this fellow. He was just sort of sitting there, with his pistol, sort of just playing with it. Saul just kept this javelin there. He was sitting there with his javelin, and he was turning it over, and he was looking at it, and he was polishing it, and whatever he was doing. And David was playing music. In verse 10, Saul sought to smite David even to the wall with a javelin, but he slipped out of Saul's presence. And they smote the javelin into the wall, and David fled and escaped that night. Saul then sent messengers unto David's house to watch him, and to slay him in the morning. And Michal, David's wife, told him, said, if you don't save your life tonight, tomorrow you're going to be dead. Well, David contrived to escape. Michal let him down through a window, and he went and fled and escaped. And Michal then made this image, this dummy there in the bed. And she put a pillow of goat's hair there and covered it with cloth, and she fixed it up. And it looked like somebody lying up in bed asleep. Well, the next morning, Saul sent messengers to take David, and she told him, verse 14, he's sick. He's sick in bed. He can't come. Well, the messengers went back and told Saul in verse 15. Saul sent the messengers again to David and said, you bring him here, bring him in his bed, that I may slay him. Just pick up the bed and haul it in here. I want him, and I want him right now. I'm going to kill him. Saul had really gone off the deep end. Well, the messengers went, and they came in. They were going to rouse him out. And of course, what did they find? Well, they found when they pulled back the cover, it wasn't David. It was just this pillow and all this stuff that had been piled up to look like someone. And so here is this situation. David, after being a hero, has had to flee from the king, from his father-in-law. He has had to flee to save his life. What do you think David was thinking at this point? What do you think David was thinking that night? Well, we don't have to guess. Just turn back to Psalm 59. Psalm 59, notice the title. To the chief musician. This is a psalm of David when Saul sent and they watched the house to kill him. This is what was going on in David's mind the night these events took place. Beginning in verse 1. Deliver me from my enemies, O my God. Defend me from them that rise up against me. Deliver me from the workers of iniquity, and save me from the bloody men. Lo, they lie in wait for my soul. The mighty are gathered against me, not for my transgression nor for my sin, O Lord. They run and prepare themselves without my fault. Awake to help me, and behold. You therefore, O Lord God of hosts, the God of Israel, awake to visit all the nations. Be not merciful to any wicked transgressors. They return at evening. They make noise like a dog. They go round about the city. Well, God's going to laugh at them. And David said, He said in verse 16, I'll sing of your power. I'll sing aloud of your mercy in the morning. For you have been my defense and refuge in the day of trouble. Unto you, O my strength, will I sing, for God is my defense and the God of my mercy. Now, here was David in a very frightening situation. A situation where he had to flee for his life. But what is going on in David's mind? What is David thinking about? Well, David is thinking, he's asking God for intervention. He is thanking God. He is focused on God and the power of God. Deliver me from my enemies, O God. Deliver me from the workers of iniquity. You see, David was focusing in on God and the fact that he could count on God and trust God and look to God in all his ways. Now let's come on down. Let's come on to 1 Samuel 21. Verse 1, David came to Nob to Ahimelech the priest. And Ahimelech was afraid. There were undoubtedly rumors had gone around about a rift between David and Saul. Ahimelech was nervous about the situation. David came here to Nob, which is where the tabernacle was at that point. And David asked the priest for some food. And the priest said, well, the only thing we've got right here, right at this moment, you're in a hurry. Well, the only thing we've got is the showbread that's been taken from inside the holy place, and we were getting ready to eat it. That's just for the priests. But he talked on a little bit and realized that David was hungry. He and the ones with him hadn't had anything to eat. And as he talked with them, he made the decision that it would be appropriate to share with them what was normally only food for the priests. And he did. Then David asked him, in verse 8, he said, do you have any weapons here? Sword, spear, anything? And the priest said, well, really the only thing like that we have is the sword of Goliath, which is laid up as a memorial before the Lord. It's wrapped up over there. It's in the tabernacle. That's the sword that you took from Goliath. I guess I can let you have that. You're the one that brought it here. So I'll give you that. Well, David arose, verse 10, and fled that day for fear of Saul. And he came to the king of Gath. Now, while all of this was going on, we're told in verse 7 that a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, and his name was Doeg the Edomite. Now, we're going to see that proved to be significant. Well, David fled down to the Philistines, to Gath. Now, the Philistines were the implacable enemies of Israel. David was on the run from Saul. You ever have what seemed to you to be a good idea at the time, and after you began to carry out the plan, you realized this was not nearly as good an idea as it seemed like? I guess we've all had a few ideas like that where we thought we had something all figured out, and all of a sudden we realized we had gone from being in the frying pan to being in the fire. We had made an error in judgment. Well, David fled, and he thought, I'll go to the king of Gath. I'll go down there to the Philistines. I'm fleeing from Saul. They'll let me stay there, and then Saul can't get me. I mean, he can't come. He's not going to invade the Philistines. Well, David came, and the servants of the king here in verse 11 said, David, why, do you know who this guy is? He is the hero. He is the national hero of Israel. They sing one to another of him in dances, saying Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. And it's us they're talking about him slaying. You realize who this is? Well, David laid up these words in his heart, and he was sore afraid of the king of Gath. He thought, oh no, this was not one of my wise moves. I thought I was going to get away from Saul. I get down here, and these guys are telling the king, said, look, this rift between David and Saul, undoubtedly, that's a put-up. David is the hero of Israel. He's down here for no good. Why, he has led the armies against us and defeated us time and again. There's something wrong. Well, David heard this, he overheard it, and he was scared. And so verse 13, he changed his behavior before them. And he feigned himself mad in their hands. He started just acting like he was crazy, and he was scrabbling at the gate and dribbling spittle down in his beard, and started acting like he was insane. And the king said to his servants, "This guy's nuts. He's crazy. He's mad. Why have you brought him in here? I don't need any more madmen. You brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence. I don't want him here. Get him out of here." And so David departed thence, and he escaped to the cave of Adullam. He got out. Now, what was going on in David's mind at this point? Well, let's go back to Psalm 56. Psalm 56, the title says, "To the chief musician." This was a psalm of David when the Philistines took him in Gath. We just read about that. What was David thinking? Now, David was afraid. We read, earlier about Saul being afraid, and he kept thinking David was his enemy and David was out to get him. When David was in Gath, he wasn't being paranoid. He was just being realistic. I mean, these guys really were out to get him. But you remember Saul had built this thing up in his own mind, and he was so convinced. He was so convinced that David was out to get him. We find his fears just controlled him. But notice what David was thinking when he was scared. Psalm 56, verse 1, "Be merciful unto me, O God, for man would swallow me up. He fighting daily oppresses me. My enemies would daily swallow me up. They be many that fight against me. O you Most High, what time I am afraid, I will trust in you." What did David do? Did he start throwing javelins? No, he said, when I'm afraid, I'm going to trust in you. In God I will praise His word. In God I have put my trust. I will not fear what flesh can do unto me. Every day they wrest my words. All their thoughts are against me for evil. They gather themselves together. They hide themselves. They mark my steps when they wait for my soul. They're plotting. They are trying to trap me. They are, as he says, they wrest my words. Their thoughts are against me. They try to take what I say out of context. They're out to get me. Well, verse 7, "Shall they escape by iniquity? In your anger cast down the people, O God. You tell my wanderings. Put my tears in your bottle." Verse 9, "When I cry unto you, then shall my enemies turn back. This I know, for God is for me. In God will I praise His word. In the Lord will I praise His word. In God have I put my trust. I'll not be afraid of what man can do to me." Verse 13, "You have delivered my soul from death. Will you not deliver my feet from falling, that I may walk before God in the light of the living?" David was looking to God. He was trusting God. He was developing and deepening his relationship with God. He found himself in a crisis, and he cried out to God for deliverance. Cried out and asked God to intervene over and over. Let's notice back in Psalm 34. Psalm 34, a psalm of David when he changed his behavior before Abimelech, who drove him away, and he departed. This is another name for Achish, the king of Gath. This is what was going on in David's mind. Verse 1, "I'll bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. My soul shall make her boast in the Lord. The humble shall hear thereof and be glad. Oh, magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt His name together. I sought the Lord, and He heard me. He delivered me from all my fears. They looked unto Him and were lightened. Their faces were not ashamed. This poor man cried, and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all his troubles. The angel of the Lord encamps round about them that fear Him and delivers them. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man that trusts in Him. Fear the Lord, you His saints, for there's no want to them that fear Him." Coming on down, verse 12, "What man is he that desires life and loves good days, that he may see good? Keep your tongue from evil, and your lips from speaking guile." If you want good days, you desire life, be careful of what you say. Keep your tongue from evil, keep your lips from speaking guile. Depart from evil, do good, seek peace, pursue it. The eyes of the Lord are upon the righteous, and His ears are open to their cry. The face of the Lord is against them that do evil, to cut off the remembrance of them from the earth. The righteous cry, and the Lord hears, and delivers them out of all their troubles. The Lord is near unto them that are of a broken heart, and He saves such as be of a contrite spirit. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but God, the Lord, delivers him out of them all. You see, David was learning how to trust God in every sort of circumstance. He was deepening and developing his relationship with God. God was developing within him more and more fully and more deeply the heart of a king. You see, David had courage. He was learning faith. I think if I were to pick out three characteristics of David that I think are perhaps his three outstanding characteristics, the qualities of faith, courage, and loyalty come to mind. You could probably think of a lot of others and maybe put them together, but I think God developed within David a genuine faith. David learned to really walk with God, to trust God. God was real to him. David lived and walked before God in the fear of the Lord, in the awe and reverence of God. God was real to him. David had courage. And that courage became more and more based upon the faith that he had in God. And God developed within him this quality of loyalty. David exemplified that loyalty. He was loyal to Saul even when Saul didn't deserve it. Because you see, first and foremost, David was loyal to God. And because David was loyal to God, he exemplified a right kind of loyalty. God worked with David and trained David through circumstances. If we come back to Psalm 52, this is to the chief musician. This is a psalm of David when Doeg the Edomite came and told Saul and said unto him, David is come to the house of Ahimelech. You see, Doeg, we read, when David came there to the priests of Nob, Doeg was there. He overheard. He went back and told Saul, and Saul finally came down there with an army and actually had the priest brought before him. And he ordered them killed, and his own soldiers standing there had enough fear of God. They wouldn't take a sword against one of God's priests. And Saul looked over to Doeg, and he says, you do it. And Doeg did it. You know, Doeg was a despicable character. He was one of these little sneaks that went around, sort of eavesdropping and running up and down. He was the kind of fellow who was always stirring up trouble. He thought he was going to get in good with Saul, so he would tell him that David had been down there and get these priests in trouble. Psalm 52, verse 1, what was going on in David's mind? Here's what he thought about Doeg. Why boast yourself in mischief, O mighty man? The goodness of God endures continually. Your tongue devises mischiefs like a sharp razor, working deceitfully. You love evil more than good, and lying more than to speak righteousness. You love all devouring words, O you deceitful tongue. God shall likewise destroy you forever. He shall take you away and pluck you out of your dwelling place and root you out of the land of the living. Verse 6, the righteous also shall see and fear and shall laugh at him. Lo, this is the man that made not God his strength, but trusted in the abundance of his riches and strengthened himself in his wickedness. But I'm like a green olive tree in the house of my God. I trust in the mercy of God forever and ever. David said, Doeg, you're going to get yours. God isn't real to you. You wouldn't go up and down saying the kind of things you're saying. Your tongue wouldn't be like a sharp razor ready to slice people. You wouldn't be, instead of trusting God, you're trusting in the abundance of riches. You think you're going to get in good with Saul. You think you're going to be rewarded. And you're laying your plans and your traps and you're doing this evil, despicable thing against the people of God. You've lifted up your hand against God's priests. Doeg, God's going to deal with you. See, David had confidence. David had confidence. He knew that God was real. He knew you couldn't act that way and live that way and deal with other people that way and escape the judgment of God. Well, there are various other places we could look. We read in 1 1 Samuel 22, verse 1, that when David fled from there, he went down to the cave of Adullam. And that's where he went to hide. Well, Psalm 142 is David's prayer when he was in the cave. I cried unto the Lord with my voice. With my voice unto the Lord did I make supplication. I poured out my complaint before him. I showed before him my trouble. When my spirit was overwhelmed within me, then you knew my path. In the way wherein I walked, they privately laid a snare for me. I looked on my right hand, and behold, there was no man that would know me. Refuge failed me. No man cared for my soul. I was deserted. I was fleeing for my life. I cried unto the Lord. I said, you are my refuge and my portion in the land of the living. Attend unto my cry, for I am brought very low. Deliver me from my persecutors. They're stronger than I. Bring my soul out of prison, that I may praise your name. The righteous shall compass me about, for you shall deal bountifully with me. David had confidence in God, even in the depths of some of these problems. As he found himself in an absolutely untenable situation, fleeing, his life threatened, people laying all sorts of evil plots. Now we're told in 1 Samuel 22, David departed, he escaped to the cave of Adullam. When his brethren and all his father's house heard it, they went there. Verse 2, everyone that was in distress and everyone that was in debt and everyone that was discontented gathered themselves together unto him, and he became a captain over them. Boy, what a crowd he collected. You know, all the down and outers, all the ne'er-do-wells, everybody that was in trouble for something, they decided, well, we'll go down there and we'll join up with David. But you know, David continued to go forward. David was looking at what God was able to do. So David, the prophet Gad told him, verse 5, don't abide in the hole, depart and get into the land of Judah. And David departed, came to the forest of Hereth. And as it came on down, Saul was just furious, you know, over all this, and he was accusing his servants of conspiring, and this is when Doeg decided to get in good with him and tell him about seeing David having come to Nob, and that's recorded here in verse 9. And so in verse 11 we have this account of the king calling Ahimelech the priest and bringing them there. Now, let's notice back in Psalm 63. This is David's psalm when he was in the wilderness of Judah. You see, he was the priest, or the prophet Gad had told him to leave the hold and go back to the wilderness of Judah. We saw that in chapter 1 Samuel 22, verse 5. And so here's David. Here's David in the wilderness of Judah. He said, O God, you are my God. Early will I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh longs for you in a dry and thirsty land where no water is, to see your power and your glory, so as I've seen you in the sanctuary. David was desiring to deepen his relationship with God, to walk with God. And he talks about in verse 6, when I remember you upon my bed and meditate on you in the night watches, because you've been my help. Therefore in the shadow of your wings will I rejoice. My soul follows hard after you. Your right hand upholds me. Those that seek my soul to destroy it shall go to the lower parts of the earth. They'll fall by the sword. But the king shall rejoice in God. You see, the mouth of them that speak lies shall be stopped. David was fleeing. David was in trouble. But David was deepening his walk with God. God was preparing David for a great and mighty thing. In the we could go on. We could look at here in 1 Samuel 23. David was fleeing. He was on the road. Verse 19, the Ziphites came to Saul, to Gibeah. It says, David hides himself with us in a strongholds in the wood. Here were people that David thought were his friends, thought would protect him, and they were betraying him. They came to Saul, and they said, he's out there, he's hiding in the woods, he's hiding there among us. Well, notice back in Psalm 54. This is Psalm written to the chief musician. This is a psalm of David when the Ziphites came and told Saul, David hides himself with us. See, David was being betrayed by people. Psalm 54, verse 1, Save me, O God, by your name, and judge me by your strength. Hear my prayer, O God. Give ear to the words of my mouth. Strangers are risen up against me. Oppressors seek after my soul. They've not set God before them. God is my helper. The Lord is with them that uphold my soul. He shall reward evil to my enemies. Cut them off in your truth. Verse 7, He's delivered me out of all trouble. My eye has seen His desire upon my enemies. David put it in God's hands. David learned to trust God and to walk with God time after time after time. Let's just notice one other account. Let's notice 1 Samuel 24. First Samuel 24. Notice in verse 1. It came to pass when Saul was returned from following the Philistines, it was told, David hides in the wilderness of En-Gedi. Saul took 3,000 chosen men, went to seek David. He came there to the sheepcotes. By the way, there was a cave. Saul went in to cover his feet. And David and his men remained in the sides of the cave. Here was Saul coming in to relieve himself and had no idea. You know, he went in this little cave, had no idea. It was dark in there. He had no idea that David and his men, that was the very cave that he picked to go into, was the place where David and his men were hidden. And the men of David said, Behold, the day which the Lord has said, I'll deliver your enemies into your hand. You can finish him off. What was David thinking? Well, Psalm 57. This is, to the chief musician, this is a psalm of David when he fled from Saul in the cave. He said, Be merciful unto me, O God, be merciful unto me. My soul trusts in you. In the shadow of your wings will I take refuge. I'll cry unto God Most High, unto God that performs all things for me. He'll send from heaven and save me from the reproach of him that would swallow him up. Be you exalted, verse 5. They've prepared a net for my steps, verse 6. My soul is bowed down. They've digged a pit before me. Verse 7, My heart is fixed, O God. My heart is fixed. I will sing and give praise. Awake up, my glory. Awake, psaltery and harp. I myself will awake early. I'll praise you, O Lord, among the people. I'll sing unto you among the nations. Your mercy is great in the heavens, your truth unto the clouds. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be above all the earth. David was focusing in on God and trusting God, and he said, God, you're merciful to me. I'm not going to start stepping in and taking your prerogatives and doing what you will do. David was learning to trust God. Now, David went through all these experiences in his 20s. He became king at age 30. David went through these things over and over, and we could go on through David's life and we could look at the events of his kingship. But you see, God was preparing in him more and more fully the heart of a king. He was learning to trust God and to walk with God in every sort of circumstance. God let him fall into different difficulties and adversities. And in the context of that, David learned to trust. He learned to walk with God. And God was real to him. And David had that heart of a king. In 2 Samuel 23, verse 1, what has David learned through these 40 years of kingship and through those years of preparation prior? 2 Samuel 23:1, these be the last words of David. David, the son of Jesse, the man who was raised up on high, the anointed of the God of Jacob, the sweet psalmist of Israel, said, The Spirit of the Lord spoke by me, and his word was in my tongue. The God of Israel said, The rock of Israel spoke unto me, He that rules over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God. Then he'll be like the light of the morning when the sun rises. So, what David had learned in his lifetime, what David had learned about being a king was that he that rules over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God. That God is real and you live your life before Him and you carry out and administer the government in a way with which God will be pleased because you're ruling in the fear of God. Rulers must be just. You've got to be fair and equitable. You've got to be righteous in your dealings with those over whom you have authority. Because you've got to rule in the fear of God. David learned that. And that was indelibly a part of the character of David. And as he approached the end of his life, he looked back. And he says, one thing I know. Rulers must be accountable to God. They must rule in the fear of God. And if they do, they're going to be just and fair. Notice in a few pages over, 1 Kings chapter 2. Here is David, 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 1. Now the days of David drew near that he should die. And he charged Solomon his son, saying, I go the way of all the earth. Be you strong, therefore, and show yourself a man. And keep the charge of the eternal your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his judgments, his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all you do and wherever you turn yourself, that the Lord may continue his word which he has spoken concerning me. So, David's instruction to Solomon, he says, you've got to walk with God. You've got to obey God. You've got to keep his commandments. You've got to seek to please God in every aspect of your life. I'm getting ready to die, and you're going to be the king. I go the way of all the earth. You need to be strong. You need to be a strong and courageous king. You need to walk with God. You need to trust God. God must be real to you. Notice, in closing, back in Psalm 72. This is a psalm for Solomon. This is what David wrote at the very end of his life. Chronologically, the last of the psalms that David wrote. A psalm for Solomon. Verse 1, give the king your judgments, O God, and your righteousness unto the king's son. He shall judge your people with righteousness, and your poor with judgment. Verse 4, he shall judge the poor of the people. He shall save the children of the needy, and shall break in pieces the oppressor. They shall fear you as long as the sun and moon endure throughout all generations. He shall come down like rain upon the mown grass, and showers that water the earth. In his day shall the righteous flourish, the abundance of peace, so long as the moon endures. Here's David's prayer for Solomon. Give him your judgments. Let him be a good king. What did David say a good king would do? Well, he will judge the people with righteousness. He'll judge the poor. He'll judge the poor of the people. He'll save the children of the needy. He'll break in pieces the oppressor. A good king. David said, here's David at the end of his life as he looks back over what it meant to be a king. And he said a good king is one who is concerned about people. One who will help and serve. One who will use the power and the authority of that office to help and to serve. To take care of those who are in need. To help those who are being taken advantage of and oppressed. Not somebody who's going to be paid off. Not somebody who's going to sort of just go along with his buddies and take advantage of and mistreat people who can't defend themselves. No, he's going to be a king that walks in the fear of God. God is real to him, and he looks on people with kindness and compassion, and he's trying to help and to serve and to give and to build. He is a true servant leader. He'll be a pleasure. In his days, the righteous will flourish, and the abundance of peace. Verse 12, he will deliver the needy when he cries, the poor also, and him that has no helper. He'll spare the poor and the needy, and he'll save the souls of the needy. He'll redeem their souls from deceit and violence. The precious shall be their blood in his sight. He'll live, and to him shall be given the gold of Sheba. Yeah, he will help and give and serve. He'll take care of those who are in need. He will be concerned about them. The most poor, small, and insignificant person in the nation will be important to him. Precious will be their blood in his sight. So, This was David's prayer for Solomon. He told Solomon, his prayer was, if you're this kind of king, your name will endure forever. Verse 18, Blessed be the Lord God, the God of Israel, who only does wondrous things. Blessed be His glorious name forever, and let the whole earth be filled with His glory. Amen and amen. The prayers of David, the son of Jesse, are ended. David's prayer for Solomon, his psalm for Solomon at the end of his life, looking back and reflecting on the kind of king that he wanted his son to be. This is what David had learned about being a king. God had developed within David the heart of a king. And God is seeking, through circumstances, to develop in each and every one of us the heart of a king.